We now move to item 11, which is today's scheduled short debate, and I call on Neil Hamilton to speak to the topic he has chosen.
Thank you, Acting Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to be back in the Chamber for the first time since March, although I apologise to my old parliamentary colleague, the Minister, for detaining him for so late in the day, but I'm delighted to see him. Can't think of anybody better to answer this debate. Well, this debate arises, as I'm sure everybody realises, from the politically motivated campaign by supporters of the Marxist pressure group Black Lives Matter to remove a statue of Sir Thomas Picton from Cardiff City Hall and a war memorial obelisk from Picton Terrace, or just outside Picton Terrace, in Carmarthen. And this campaign is nothing less than an attempt to erase an important part of Wales's history. And the removal of either of these monuments, in my view, would be an act of cultural and artistic vandalism. Both of them are listed and protected by Cadw as monuments of historic, artistic and architectural significance. The statue in City Hall is a Grade 1 listed structure, and the obelisk is listed Grade 2. The statue in City Hall is integral to the 11 statues of Welsh heroes that are in the Marble Hall. And the Marble Hall is also listed Grade 1, and the ensemble, both the hall and the statues together, are also listed as being Grade 1 and therefore of the utmost significance. Indeed, as Cardiff City Hall's own website explains, suggestions for the subjects of the statues were invited 100 years ago from all over Wales, and each statue is the work of a different sculptor. And it was a 20th century hero, David Lloyd George, who at that time was the Secretary of State for War, but would shortly thereafter become Prime Minister, who unveiled the statues. And a painting of that ceremony is displayed in the hall. The 11 heroes of Wales, and a very diverse collection they are, were chosen by the Welsh people in open competition, a competition that was held by the Western Mail, and the statues were not paid for by the taxpayer, they were paid by Lord Rhondda in a magnificent gift. Now, a collection of politically motivated nobodies on Cardiff City Council wants to vandalise this artistic conception by removing the Picton statue. The other heroes include Boadicea and Henry VII, neither of whom, I think, by common consent, was a 20th century woke liberal. And indeed, both of them slaughtered their opponents without scruple. So how long will it be before the nobodies move on to them to erect the statue of their hero in their place, career criminal and drug dealer George Floyd? Why did the Welsh people choose in a free vote to commemorate Sir Thomas Picton as one of the 11 heroes? Well, he was the highest-ranking officer to be killed in the Battle of Waterloo. He was a lieutenant general, and as Wellington's dispatch at the time recorded, he fell gloriously, leading his division to a charge with bayonets, by which one of the most serious attacks made by the enemy of our position was defeated. Picton was a man of fearless valour, and his last words leading the charge were, "Charge, charge, hurrah, hurrah." And amazingly, 2 days before, at the other important skirmish before the Battle of Waterloo at Cateau, he had been shot in the hip by a musket ball and was in considerable pain. But he concealed this. The only person he told about the wound was his servant. He didn't seek any medical assistance at all. He bandaged the wound up and carried on fighting. His valour at Waterloo was matched in the preceding years because he played a pivotal part in the road to Waterloo through Spain in the Peninsular War. And he was, I think, a very significant element in forcing the French out of Spain, where, of course, Napoleon had installed his brother as the king. And the battles in which Picton played such an important part are commemorated on the obelisk in Carmarthen. The battles of Busaco, Fuentes d'Onoro, Badajoz, which was a very terrible engagement. He was severely wounded there as well. But he wouldn't leave the ramparts, and the day after, having recently inherited a fortune, having won the battle, he gave every survivor under his command a guinea, which was a considerable sum in those days. He then was invalided home, but he returned later in the year to fight the battles of Vittoria and to fight through the Pyrenees. This was a very important part of forcing Napoleon back to ultimately Waterloo and his own personal destruction. And Picton was awarded the KCB, and he became the Member of Parliament for Pembroke Boroughs. After he was killed at Waterloo, his body was brought home in state, accompanied by a regiment of soldiers who took over a week to get from Deal, where they landed, to London, where he was buried, first of all, in St George's, Hanover Square, but a public monument was erected by order of Parliament in St Paul's Cathedral. When Wellington died in 1852, a decision was taken to exhume Picton from St George's, Hanover Square, and he was then reburied in St Paul's Cathedral, which is where he lies today. Of course, his life did have certain controversies in it, which were well known at the time, when he was governor of Trinidad, but his defence to the charges that were laid against him was that he was acting under the orders of his superior officer, Abercrombie, who said that he had to administer the law according to the laws of Spain, from whom Britain had recently taken Trinidad. But history is a checkerboard, and we have to accept the good with the bad, the black squares as well as the white squares. Guy Gibson won the Victoria Cross for the Dam Busters raid, but as everybody knows, he had a dog called Nigger, and would that bar him, similarly, from being commemorated today? Well, I think not. Nobody approves of using words like that anymore, but we have to recognise that these men were men of their time in their different ways, and that has, I think, to be accommodated. It's very important, I think, that we should memorialise Welsh and British heroes, because the history of a nation defines that nation, and ripping up every reference which we find inconvenient today to our great history and heritage is not, I think, something to be proud of. History should always be judged in its own context, and the motives of those who judge history in today's context, I think, should be treated with suspicion, because more often than not, as in this case, the motivation will be for some kind of political objective and not revising an historical narrative. These are great people who are being commemorated for the great things that they did during their time. And removing problematic statues will not, of course, wash away the painful periods of our past. It seems that no statue is safe. Picton, I've spoken about. And the paradox of Picton is that the man he was fighting, Napoleon, had actually reintroduced slavery into the West Indies in 1802, it having first of all been abolished by the revolutionary government in 1794. And so the ultimate victory of Waterloo, in which Picton himself played a significant part, was responsible for the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. And so is that not another reason why we should commemorate Sir Thomas Picton? The contrast with France is very significant, of course. While we have people in this country who want to get rid of monuments to Picton, Napoleon still lies in state in the Hôtel des Invalides and is regarded as one of the great Frenchmen, even though he tried to enslave the whole of Europe. The Welsh government has also targeted Winston Churchill as somebody perhaps who is problematic, the man who fought against racism and fascism in the form of Nazism, and whose great speeches in 1940 and afterwards inspired the nation to ultimate success and the destruction of Nazism. Lord Nelson also, he's in the firing line, even though he had no meaningful links with slavery and paralysed French and Spanish naval dominance at Trafalgar. These three historical figures alone changed the landscape of Britain, and without their victories in the Napoleonic Wars or the Second World War, Britain would have fallen to European militarised dictatorial powers. Welsh Labour, in my view, and it's not just Welsh Labour, but they are the government, of course, is creating visible problems in today's society with their audit of these statues. It's no wonder that in a recent survey, 55% of UK adults believe that Black Lives Matter have increased racial tensions, and 44% of ethnic minorities also believe that Black Lives Matter have raised racial tensions. This feeds into the wider cancel culture that is taking over Western society. As Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked magazine, which I used to subscribe to when it was called Living Marxism, describes it as the woke elites have launched a neo-Maoist war on the past. We've seen the ultimate expression of that, of course, in Cambodia, where they turned the clock back to year zero, and the killing fields were the consequence. Well, of course, I'm not comparing the ambitions of those who want to remove General Picton with Pol Pot in Cambodia. But nevertheless, I think it's a significant point which needs to be considered. There is a toxic culture which has been brought on by the Black Lives Matter syndrome, if I can put it like that, which has meant that people can't express their views anymore safely online. They risk their jobs simply for taking pride in or standing up for their heritage. I'll give you one example. There was a man who flew White Lives Matter as a banner above Burnley Football Club. He lost his job as a result. Manx Radio took Stu Peters off the air after he questioned white privilege. I've had people write to me to have been threatened with disciplinary action at work for sharing content online from mainstream political parties on the subject of Black Lives Matter protests where war memorials have been vandalised. This entire statues, streets and building names review that the Welsh Government is currently embarking on is completely down to Black Lives Matter. They acknowledge that in their announcement of the audit. This is an inherently Marxist body which wishes to destroy our very way of life, which is why they're attacking our history and heritage. I mean, their explicit aims are, and I quote from their website, to dismantle capitalism, to defund the police, abolish prisons, and get rid of borders. Is this what the Welsh Government really believes in? Well, anybody with an understanding of history must realise it's totally inappropriate to hold people of the past to the standards of today. We had a minute's silence in this place for George Floyd. When I asked that shortly afterwards there should be a commemoration for the 3 people who were murdered in a public park in Reading by an Islamic extremist who was convicted only a couple of weeks ago for those murders, answer came there none, certainly not an affirmative one. Well, I think this is an unfortunate way in which to proceed. But an essential knowledge of Britain's past, I think, is being replaced by politically correct topics in some of our educational institutions. And some of the most important and influential historical events are ignored or downplayed, even things like the English Civil War, Industrial Revolution, horrors of the Soviet Union, etc. And if children aren't taught about the history, they can't be fully conversant with it, and consequently future generations risk being even more detached from their ancestors and ultimately their country as a whole. A great French philosopher and writer, Alexis de Tocqueville, once said that as the past ceases to throw its light upon the future, the mind of man wanders in obscurity. And I think the removal of statues conveys a stark message that Britain's historical figures who shaped Britain into the country which it is today should be forgotten. And never let it be forgotten that we were the first country to abolish the slave trade itself, at a time when slavery was commonplace around the world. African tribes enslaved each other. The Ottomans enslaved occupied territories and so on. We should be proud that we were the first country to outlaw the slave trade. In 1808, we established the West Africa Squadron to patrol the seas to eliminate any remnants of the slave trade. We captured 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 African slaves. Well, why shouldn't they be commemorated? Instead of tearing down statues, we should be erecting more of them to other heroes who don't have appropriate commemoration. So I call upon the government to abandon its campaign to take down these essential parts of our heritage. But the public, of course, are not buying the narrative. In the case of the Carmarthen obelisk, the Culture Committee this week received evidence about the consultation that Carmarthenshire County Council have been engaged in, and the public are overwhelmingly against removing the obelisk, 2 to 1, and 3 separate age groups in which they've been grouped, 16 to 24, 25 to 54 and 55 plus, consistently across the generations, the majority against removing the obelisk is the same. So I'm just winding up. We have to come to terms with our heritage, So I hope that this debate will be an opportunity whereby we can start this process of assimilating our past in a way that we can be proud of, but without disguising those parts of it which need to be known about and which we would no longer find acceptable today.